All right, sounds good. Welcome everyone to Department Seminar. I'm Ankur Desai. I'm here to introduce our speaker, Sreenath Paleri, and it's my pleasure to do so. Sreenath is a PhD student in our department, and he's being advised by me and a member of our lab. He is entering now his third year of the PhD and has been doing all sorts of interesting work with flux towers, and including fluxes that you can measure from airplane, which may be not something you're all familiar with, and so you'll be hearing some more about. By way of introduction, so Sreenath got his bachelor's in civil engineering and master's in applied mechanics at the Indian Institute of Technology in Madras. And during his master's work, he actually did some more laboratory type investigations of particle turbulence interaction in convection using laser backscatter imaging. And after he graduated in 2013, he spent some time actually in a couple projects. The one that was the most interesting one on his CV was this one. I'll read it. It says, constructed a 3.6 by 0.8 meter wide handmade concrete canoe. You'll have to ask him more about that, but he's had a wide range of experiences beyond building concrete canoes, but also working on building some flux towers in India. And not surprisingly, when I learned that he had done that, then I was starting a project where we were maybe putting another 19 more. It was a natural fit for him to come and join and kind of build on his work that he's doing already. So Sreenath participated in the cheesehead field experiment that most of you have heard about, and you'll be hearing more about in this talk. And we're excited to hear some of the early results we're getting from our airborne measurements here. So the title of Sreenath's talk today is Scale Resolved Flux Contributions to Surface Atmosphere Interactions Across a Mid-Latitude Heterogeneous Landscape from Airborne Measurements. And with that, I'll turn it over to you.
Thanks, Ankur. Can you hear me okay? Am I audible?
Your audio is fine. I can see your slides.
Oh, good. Good. Good afternoon, everyone. And today, as Ankur mentioned, I'm talking about how heterogeneous ecosystems and the lower atmosphere communicate with each other using the data that we collected during the cheesehead field experiments from airborne measurements. A general outline of the talk is I start with the motivation for the study, essentially talking about the role of landscape heterogeneity in lower atmospheric response, and then go into the cheesehead experiment design and the aircraft campaign design, and how the data that were collected were analyzed, and then talk about some of the preliminary observations and the ongoing work. Before I begin, I'd like to acknowledge that this project occurred on the traditional territory of the Ojibwe people. And okay, so we know that the land surface is heterogeneous at multiple scales because of variations in
Hey,
multiple
Sreenath,
properties.
can I interrupt for a sec? We're still on your title slide. I didn't know if that's what you intended, but just wanted to double check.
Yeah, his connection has been a little bit poor, and I think it's showing up. I'm getting some choppy audio as well. I know he's got his video turned off. That should hopefully help.
Okay.
I'm not sure what we can really do about that.
Okay, I now see your landscape scale variability slide.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you. Yeah, can you the landscape scale variability slide now?
Yes, and it's right now we see your PowerPoint slides not in present mode.
This is Brad. I still just see the first slide.
Okay.
I'm seeing the variability slide.
Stop sharing and sharing.
Yeah. If it might help, you could email me the slides and I could present them.
Okay, let me just try sharing one more time. I was using a second monitor. I'll just stop that and start sharing just my screen. can you see my screen now?
Yes.
Yeah.
All right. And am I in present? And is it in the slideshow mode now?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. Yeah. Sorry everyone for that. I'll just start again. So am I in the outline slide now?
Yep. Audio is still a little choppy on my end.
Okay. I'll just move closer to my router then. Okay. Hopefully this resolves all the issues. I've moved closer to our router, and that's probably, hopefully, will help us better. So yeah, to start out again, the general outline for today's talk is that I'll start with the motivation, where I'll introduce the what are the roles of landscape scale surface heterogeneity that would be of importance for a lower atmospheric response, and then go into the cheesehead experiment design, the flight campaign, and the analysis framework, how we analyze the data, and then talk about some of the preliminary observations about scale reserve fluxes and how we are taking it forward. So once again, before I begin, I'd like to acknowledge that this project occurred on the traditional territory of the Ojibwe people. And then to start, you know that the land surface can be heterogeneous because multiple land surface properties can vary simultaneously at multiple scales, and the corresponding atmospheric responses to these variations in multiple scales would also be scale dependent and can be nonlinear. Just to illustrate this point, what you see at the bottom left are measurements that were made around one of the towers of the cheesehead field experiment. On the left hand side, you can see the surface temperature measurements, and the right hand side are canopy height measurements. You can note that even though they seem to co-vary, there are finer scale variations that are not entirely related with each other. So there are variations, spatial variations at multiple scales. Similarly, the landscape does not only vary in space, there are also variations as the seasons change. There are seasonal transitional variations. In the figures on the left-hand side, the top two are images, phenocam images taken at another tower site. The image labeled E was taken on July 12th, and the image labeled F was taken on October 9th. You can see that as the landscape, you can see the effect of landscape transitioning from an early summer to an early fall landscape, where senescence has almost setting in. And the bottom two figures are averaged heat fluxes across about 20 stars that were part of the field experiments. The blue line is the latent heat flux, and the red line is the sensible heat flux. You can see that as the landscape changes from a more foresty landscape to a more patchy one, there is a change in the partitioning associated with the heat fluxes. It transitions from a more latent heat flux dominated landscape to a more less latent heat flux and with more importance to the sensible heat flux. So there is a variation not only in how properties change spatially, but there is also a variation in the heat fluxes and the surface properties with seasons. So how do you quantify these flux transitions, or how do you quantify even the fluxes? And the fluxes that are that are how energy and mass transported from the surface can be measured by using covariances. So essentially, when you are looking at the transport across a horizontal surface, it can be computed as the covariance between a plane normal vertical wind velocity and some scalar. To illustrate this point, consider a statically unstable boundary layer, and you have a positive vertical velocity perturbation pushing a warmer air parcel aloft or a negative vertical velocity perturbation pushing a colder air parcel below, that would mean you have positive heat flux and an eddy that is doing this transport. Similarly, there could be a statically stable stratification with a positive vertical velocity perturbation pushing colder air parcel up, or a negative vertical velocity perturbation pushing warmer air below. That would mean you have a negative heat flux across this interface. And this using the covariance approach, you can theoretically measure the heat or mass transport across a surface. And conventionally, these are done using tower-mounted instrumentation. And this is a schematic of such a setup where there is a forest canopy and a tower has been placed in it with you can see a sonic anemometer here, a tiny sonic anemometer that measures high frequency wind temperature data. And then there is what we call as a gas analyzer that can measure high frequency measurements of water vapor and carbon dioxide. And using these high frequency measurements, one can compute the covariances of vertical wind with the relevant scalar, be it temperature or water vapor or carbon dioxide. And this involves some set of assumptions, some of them being more strict than the others. And the first one of importance would be that the boundary layer is well mixed, right? Like eddies are the primary transport mechanisms, and all the transport of importance is carried by the eddies. Like basically, there is good transport by the eddy, so that whatever the tower is measuring is actually the true transport. And secondly, that the tower is actually what the tower is measuring or what the tower is seeing is representative of the landscape around it, or you invoke an assumption of some sort of horizontal homogeneity. And then thirdly, that the turbulence over your averaging interval is stationary, that or in simpler words, it makes sense to have a mean velocity and to have perturbations around this mean velocity for the averaging times that you choose. But in reality, so these are idealistic assumptions, right, which is unfortunately not the reality. These measurements are actually limited by tower footprints. Essentially, the tower is not always looking at what is happening all over around it. The tower can only see whatever falls within its own footprint or whatever the main wind is pushing towards it. And I'm hearing some beeps. Am I cutting out or something?
There's some comments in the chat that there's some static on your voice that makes it a little bit harder to hear you on. I'm not sure what that's from because your connection looks good. So that was basically it.
Yep.
Okay. Okay, cool. So then I'll continue. So yeah, so in reality, the tower measurements are limited by the tower footprints, and the assumptions of horizontal homogeneity are not always valid. Like you're not always placing your towers in really flat agricultural fields or really smooth and soft canopies. And this assumption that the turbulence is stationary for conventional averaging times that are about 15 to 30 minutes need not always be valid too. And this can lead to interesting artifacts and measurements that might not be representative of the true exchange processes. And that brings us into one of the outstanding problems in micrometeorology, which is the non-closure of measured surface energy balance at eddy-covariance tower sites. So the surface energy balance can be expressed as a balance between input energy, where it is the balance between measured net radiation and ground heat flux, and measured turbulent heat fluxes of sensible and latent heat, along with the storage term. You can assume that over diurnal scales, the storage term should not play that much of a role. However, across sites and across climatic conditions, it has been noted that there is a persistent residual for the surface energy budget. The figure on the right hand side are these components of the energy budget measured at over 20 tower sites. The averaged components from July to October of 2019 as part of the GSET experiment. You can look at the blue line, which is the average residual. And not only is there a persistent residual, but it also has a strong diurnal characteristics. So from the a lot of reasons have been postulated for the presence of the residual, starting with that the instruments are not good enough. And even though the sonic anemometers and gas analyses were always state of the art when they were developed, there was some merit to that argument earlier. But even with really precise instrumentation and really careful measurements, it has been observed that these energy balance residuals persisted. And one of the dominant hypotheses of late is that there are sub-mesoscale transport processes that are not actually captured by single point measurements. And this is the figure from one of the early reviews of the surface energy balance closure problem from POC in 2008. So 2008 is actually an early review for the energy balance problem. And what they noted, they compared measurements from multiple field experiments. They went over all the then current issues and postulated that this problem is could essentially be a scale problem, because there could be longer scale and larger length circulations in the boundary layer that are not being sampled by a tower that would be kept, say, here, when you have these larger scale structures present in the boundary layer. And they noted that you get better closure of the budget with longer averaging times when you're including motions of large scales, or when you do spatial measurements with scintillometers, which look at the heat fluxes across the area. And later, in STOI 2013, they did a much more comprehensive analysis of about 173 tower sites that are part of FluxNet. So FluxNet is this international sort of collection of flux tower sites that are scattered globally. And they also noted that this energy balance non-closure worsens with the presence of surface heterogeneity. In this figure from STOI 2013, the x-axis is standard deviation of the vegetation index, which can be looked at as a measure of the surface heterogeneity, and the y-axis is a normalized energy balance index, so to say. And each of the symbols represent different ecosystem types, and all of them have multiple data points within them average into 1 point. Like, say, cropland, which would be a black circle, has about 20 sites in them. And so they showed that with increasing heterogeneity in your local ecosystem, the energy balance budget residuals become higher and higher, or that the closure is worsening with increasing heterogeneity. So what are the types, what is the nature of this sub-mesoscale transport process? And some of the early simulation studies, largely simulation studies, identified that these sub-mesoscale processes could be turbulent organized structures or thermally induced mesoscale circulation. So even with a homogeneous imposed heat flux in a turbulent boundary layer, you can have roll-like vortices set up when you have a strong main wind, or you could have plume-like Rayleigh-Bernard cell-like natural convective type plumes when you have strong heat fluxes. So these structures are generally observed in the atmospheric boundary layer also, that you have roll-like vortices when there is strong winds, or there are thermals or plumes in strongly unstable convective boundary layers. And when you add heterogeneity into this equation, these structures can get more complicated. So what you see at the bottom are LDA's results from numerical experiments that were conducted as part of the LITFAS field campaign in Germany. And they are isosurfaces of heterogeneity-induced vertical velocity, where red is an updraft and blue are downdrafts. The black arrows are the mean wind directions. And there were simulations performed with heterogeneous land surface model. And they observed that there were these standing cell-like structures that were tied to land surface heterogeneity. And with the figures on the right-hand side have higher imposed mean wind than the figures on the left-hand side. And with higher imposed mean wind, they seem to be more elongated and they seem to have structures similar to the roll vortices that are observed in the atmospheric boundary layer. So in this talk and for my PhD work, I would like to ask the question that do such quasi-stationary and mesoscale eddies that are tied to landscape heterogeneity. And since conventional single-point flux measuring systems like eddy-covariance measurements at towers would miss these longer duration and larger scale fluxes, and if they can be diagnosed and if the transport in these scales can be quantified, can we actually measure the true surface energy balance or the true fluxes across heterogeneous systems? So to measure them or to diagnose them, one would need spatially resolving measurements or spatially and measurements that can resolve these large-scale measurements. Or in other words, you would need measurements and methods that can actually see the larger landscape level transport, such as aircraft measurement. Let's say you are moving you're moving across the landscape and measuring all of the fluxes, or you have a distributed tower network is capturing what is happening at every point on the landscape. So that was the motivation behind the design of the GSET field experiment. And GSET stands for the Schwammeken Heterogeneous Ecosystem Energy Balance Study enabled by high density extensive array of detectors. The idea was to intensively sample and scale land surface properties and atmospheric boundary layer response over a 10 by 10 kilometer heterogeneous domain in northern Wisconsin. The study period was from June to October of 2019, so that you can not only is the spatial heterogeneity sample, but also the seasonal shift in the landscape from late summer to early fall. And the main motivation behind the study was to determine how spatial heterogeneity of the surface impacts local atmospheric circulations and the surface energy balance, and how does the presence or absence of these circulations influence representativeness of single point surface fluxes compared to a grid mean average. And there were a suite of observations that were made for the study with 20 flux towers that included 19 flux towers above canopy and one really tall flux tower. And there were ground-based LiDAR measurements of winds, water vapor, temperature, and aerosols. There were daily radars on lodges, and airborne eddy covariance was performed using with the help of the University of Wyoming King Air research aircraft. And there were hyperspectral and drone imaging to characterize the land surface. And these measurement campaigns were designed to go hand in hand with more data-driven approaches, such as more data-driven and numerical approaches, such as large eddy simulations and machine learning-driven approaches. And all of the field data, as they are processed and coming through, are being uploaded to the NCAR EOL repository that you can see here, and they're publicly available. And I'll be talking in more detail about the airborne eddy covariance measurements and introducing our preliminary results from the same. So going into the aircraft campaign, as I mentioned, the data was collected from using the University of Wyoming King Air research aircraft, and we had 3 intensive observation periods, one each in the month of July, August, and September. And these were 1 week of observations when all of the available field instrumentations were on ground and measuring. And the aircraft measurements were also done during these intensive observation periods, which we'll call as IOPs. We had multiple flight patterns based on the prevailing direction. At the bottom, you can see two sample flight patterns, one for a northerly wind and one for a southeasterly wind, where the flight patterns were perpendicular to the prevailing wind direction. And for each IOP day of measurement, we had a morning and afternoon flight, and each flight had flight legs or transects at 100 and 400 meters. So in the sample flight patterns, the 100-meter flight legs are colored in blue, and the 400-meter flight legs are colored in red. And the flights measured turbulent wind, temperature, and water vapor data, which are being analyzed for this study. And I'll also show I'll only be showing data from the 100-meter flight legs from one clear sky day from each of the three IOPs. So from these flight measurements, what we'd like to know are what are the contributions from multiple scales or from turbulent scales and from larger scales, and how do these contribute? How can you actually ascribe the contributions from different land surface features to these particular scales? Or in other words, how would you resolve the turbulent measurements in a spectral or a scale space? And how can you also understand where are these contributions coming from in the landscape? And a wavelet analysis based approach can actually help quantify the contributions from different scales and also locate them in space. To illustrate this, let me show you an example. So the figure at the center is just a reference signal with three different frequencies at three different locations in time. And the figure on the left-hand side, and bottom left-hand side, is just a Fourier transform of the signal. So even though a Fourier transform can pick out the different constituent frequencies, you wouldn't necessarily know when they occur in the input signal. But on the right-hand side is a wavelet transform of the input signal with the x is the time and y is a constituent period, and the colors denote the amplitude of the spectrum. So you can see that with the wavelet transform, you can pick out not only what are the frequencies that are present, but also when they occur in the signal. And that is what we want to do with the aircraft data. Not only pick out what are the contributions from different scales, but also localize them in space. So for the aircraft data, we have spatial data instead of these time series data as shown in the reference, but that doesn't really matter, right? And how do you actually do this, right? So it is done. So in wavelet transforms, an input data, say x, is convolved with a wavelet function that is called as a mother wavelet. And this mother wavelet has two parameters, a scale parameter A and a location parameter B. So the mother wavelet, B is a scaling parameter that is taken as square root for now, as half for now. And this mother wavelet is scaled and stretched into scaled and dilated into daughter wavelets depending on different values for A, and they are translated across different positions on X based on multiple values for B. So essentially, you're defining a function called phi, and then that mother wavelet is scaled and translated along the input data to pick out features at different scales, and also to locate where these features occurred in your input dataset. The mother wavelet used for this analysis is a complex Morley wavelet, which is essentially a complex sinusoid that is modulated by a Gaussian. And we chose this because this has been used for previous aircraft turbulent flux analysis. And using the wavelet, and using wavelet transform, you can compute a cross scalerogram for two signals x and y from the amplitude of the wavelet transform from each individual signal. and integrating them in space or time would give you the wavelet cross-scaleogram, the energy, and then integrating them across scales would give you the covariance, total covariance of two input data x and y. And then how did we compute the wavelets? The field experiment data is being hosted publicly online in the NSF funded cloud servers, and the experiment data was analyzed using eddy-covariance, which is a family of open source packages written in R and that are being developed at the Surface Atmospheric Exchange Group at NEON, which is National Ecological Observatory Network, which is a continental scale flux observatory network for North America that is NSF funded. And the code is hosted on GitHub, and it is being pulled into the analysis environment servers as Docker images. So Docker is a software that lets you create analysis environments without having to spin up virtual machines. So Docker lets you create what are called as images. So these images would have all your softwares and dependent libraries. And so instead of having to set up an entire virtual machine by itself, you can actually install Docker and set up images. And that would ensure that you have reproducibility of your software environment irrespective of hardware or system requirements. So the code and the analysis environment was adapted for the linear turbulent data and GSAID process flows. And what you see on the bottom left is an example wavelet cross-scaleogram between the vertical wind and water vapor mole fraction for one of the flight legs. So on the right-hand side is a sample flight pattern, and this cross-scaleogram is for one of the blue arrows for this flight pattern. The x-axis is distance from the west end of this track. One track, you can imagine as this is consider the first blue line on top, and the x-axis would be the distance from the west end of this track, and the y-axis is the scale that was measured, and the colors are the amplitudes of the wavelet cross-scaleogram. And the figure on top is a scale integrated, is the same figure, but with the amplitudes integrated across scale, so that the y-axis is now in energy units. And this scale integrated cross-scaleogram gives us the total flux across this flight leg as a function of the distance along the flight track. And this integration can actually be done for sub-intervals. So we've let you do that. And what was done is a turbulent fluxes were defined as fluxes that have contributions from scales up to 2 kilometers based on prior work and also based on the assumption that 2 kilometers is a good proxy for the atmospheric boundary layer height. And the fluxes that can be calculated from scales of 2 to 20 kilometers are considered as mesoscale fluxes. And so we partitioned the measured cross-scalograms as turbulent and mesoscale based on this criteria of 2 kilometers being a scale separator. And once again, the 100-meter legs from one clear sky day from each of the IOPs were analyzed. And analyzing fluxes across the IOPs would help us see how do these scale contributions change as the steady domain shifts from a more latent heat dominated and more smooth and homogeneous landscape in July to a more patchy and sensible heat flux dominated landscape in October. So now I'll briefly introduce some of the early results that we have. So what you see here are average heat flux, sensible heat flux values for the 100-meter flight legs. And what you see on the top right is the flight pattern that was used for the flight patterns used for this data. And the x-axis are the different flight legs. They are even numbered because the 100-meter flight legs are used. So for this flight pattern, the flight started on the right-hand side of the domain for a 400-meter transect, and then on the return flight, it was at 100 meters, and another transect was made. So that is why they are even numbered, because they are all for the 100-meter transects. And these are averaged values of the turbulent and mesoscale fluxes that were measured along each of the 100-meter transects. And not only are they separated in space, by the time the flight starts at one end and reaches the other end, there is also they are also separated in time. And there were the first 10 flight legs were part of the morning flights, and the last 10 were part of the afternoon flight legs. So the same pattern was repeated in the morning and afternoon. And you can see that there is some sense of diurnality to the measured turbulent heat fluxes, and they do seem to dominate the measurement. The mesoscale fluxes, there are mesoscale fluxes. They don't seem to be dominant, but they seem to become more significant later in the day, in the afternoon. And this is for July 11th, which is a summery day for northern Wisconsin. And when you go into August, when you go into IOP2, you can see that this is the flight. So once again, this is the flight pattern that is representative of the measured fluxes. So once again, the blue bars are the turbulent fluxes, and the orange bars are the mesoscale fluxes. And y-axis is sensible heat, and x are the flight legs. So here, as you go into August in IOP2, the mesoscale fluxes seem to become more dominant, and you can still see some sense of diurnality in the measured turbulent fluxes. And later, when you go into September, the mesoscale fluxes don't seem to be dominant as much, surprisingly, but there is still a very strong sense of diurnality with the measured turbulent fluxes. So in summary, what you see on the right-hand side are total averages of the turbulent and mesoscale fluxes for each of the 3 IOPs as the landscape changes from a homogeneous to a more patchy domain. For the latent heat fluxes, you could say that there are diurnal variations, but there are some variations in them calling forth some spatial dependency, and the turbulent fluxes seem to dominate, and the mesoscale fluxes seem to be larger in the afternoon. So now going into the measured latent heat fluxes. Once again, the blue bars are the measured turbulent fluxes, and the orange bars are the measured latent heat fluxes. And the measured turbulent latent heat fluxes this is for July 11, again IOP1 data. So the measured latent heat fluxes for the afternoon seem to be really low, and they seem to be anomalous, but I don't particularly see any issue with the code or the data as yet, but that has to be investigated further. But once again, the turbulent fluxes seem to be dominate, except for the afternoon, which is suspect. And when you go into IOP2 in August, the contribution from the mesoscale fluxes seem to be much higher, and the actual values of the latent heat fluxes have also decreased. Again, going into IOP3 in September, the data appears to be more wacky, with really low values for some of the flight legs and comparable values of mesoscale and turbulent fluxes later in the day, and some very strong spatial dependence in the measured values of the turbulent fluxes. So this is the representative flight pattern for this day. You can see that the turbulent fluxes are higher for the later flight legs. So the flight started at this point in space, and slowly they were moving closer to the lake. So it seems to suggest that for this particular day, the turbulent fluxes seem larger as you move closer and closer. But again, I would just wanted to point out that there is not only a diurnal variation, but also a spatial variation for the fluxes. And the figure on the right-hand side is again average turbulent and mesoscale fluxes for each of the IOPs as the landscape changes from a more homogeneous to a more patchy domain. And the averaged bar graph kind of tends to average out the differences in space, and it kind of misses out some of the more important information that is present in the more detailed even in the leg average information. But still, you can see that there is significant contribution. There are some contributions from the mesoscale fluxes that seem to be tied to variations in the land surface. And now that is what we are trying to investigate further. Like how are the scale contributions related to changes in the land surface? The figure on we see on the bottom left is a land surface class data over the domain with one of the flight legs superimposed in this white uh, dashed line, and the contours you see around it are the flux footprints for the fluxes that are measured along this flight track. So this flight track is one of the transects for this flight pattern. So essentially, this shows how the measurement was made, what were the land surface variations that fall within the footprint of this particular measurement. And on the right-hand side are LST data from EcoStrace satellite imagery. And what we're trying to do now is relate the fluxes that are measured with the variations of the land surface that are within the footprint of the measured fluxes. So how would one go about doing that? So earlier, for separating out the turbulent and mesoscale components, we defined subintervals in scale. The scales below 2 km were classified as turbulent scales, and scales above 2 km were 2 to 20 were classified as mesoscales contributions. And because this is a Wavelet cross-scaleogram, subintervals can again be defined in space. Technically, you could create block averages of some particular length, average out contributions from those spatial segments, and average out contributions from those spatial scales, and call them this much was the flux contribution from this much distance in space. So at the top are total scale integrated contributions at each point. Instead of measuring total fluxes at each point, as is done here, technically one could average out in space and measure contributions from each of the subintervals in space as well. And that is what is being done here in this plot. So I'd like you to look at only the colored line in this plot here, which is actually the sensible heat flux plot as a function of the distance. So each of the sensible heat flux values are measured as averages of 1000-meter windows. And these 1000-meter windows are centered at and these 1000-meter windows are pushed forward as 100-meter steps. So the land cover class data set that we are using comes from the WISC-LAN data set that is set up as 100-meter gridded data set. So these 100-meter windows are positioned at the center of a grid cell of the land cover dataset that is directly beneath the flight track. And then you're averaging the flux contribution from this 1000-meter window. And the color within the color that you see here are colors are corresponding to the dominant land surface type in this 1000-meter window. So different colors correspond to different land surface features, and the window is moved in increments of 1000 meters through the spectral space. And the same analysis is performed for land surface temperature also. And you can see that on the eastern end of the track, the contributions from the wet hotspots like the lakes and the wetlands can be seen as you move into the right-hand side, the eastern edge of the measured fluxes. But so this can only give us an idea about how much of the flux is coming from what type of land surface. It wouldn't it wouldn't tell us where exactly is the flux coming from on the land surface. So that is what we're trying to do now. When we have these transects and these gridded flight patterns and fluxes measured along these gridded flight patterns, they can be projected back onto the domain as to set up gridded flux estimates for the domain. So these flux maps can be calculated. So what you see at the bottom left are such gridded flux maps that were calculated from, again, flight patterns that were gridded as part of the study that was done by Mauder and others in 2008. So these gridded flux maps can be calculated for the turbulent and mesoscale contributions. And then we can investigate how these both turbulent and mesoscale flux maps relate to various variations in the land surface properties. And also, once we calculate the turbulent and mesoscale contributions across seasons, they can also be related to how the landscape changes seasonally. And then that can shed more light into how does the scale transport change as the landscape changes. So this is what we are currently working on. In conclusion, Wavelet decomposition of airborne measurements can reveal scale transport associated with surface atmospheric fluxes. And when you look at the diurnal and seasonal variation, as a preliminary look at the diurnal and seasonal variation of the fluxes shows that turbulent fluxes dominate for sensible heat fluxes with strong diurnal variations that are also spatially dependent. For latent heat fluxes, the mesoscale fluxes seem to be particularly affected by the change in landscape, and we need to do much more detailed analysis to make much more comprehensive statements. And I'd like to acknowledge NSF for their generous grant and Cybers for giving us the opportunity to host the code and the analysis platform, and the University of Wyoming Air team for doing the really low altitude flights at 100 meters, and Grant, who is a co-PI of the project and also the head of the airborne flight committee, and Jonathan, who is our amazing field tech and lab manager, James Minow, who is a sophomore in our department, who was more like the apprentice field tech for the field experiment, and Noder and Louis Wagner at KIT for their continued collaboration. So as I mentioned earlier, all of the data for the field experiment is available publicly at the NCAR EOL repository, and data from the Wyoming King Air Research flights are available at their webpage also. And thank you all for your time and listening to me. That's all.
All right, lots of applause in virtual form. Cool.
If you have any questions, I can
Yes.
take them now.
Feel free to ask questions in the chat or raise your hand.
I cannot see any of the questions now.
Yeah. I mean, I'll start off with one just to kind of get things going. I'm curious, you have this hypothesis that you'll be able to relate mesoscale versus turbulent contributions in your flux mapping. To what extent, what is your working hypothesis? What do you think you'll likely see if you start mapping just a mesoscale component of, say, the latent heat flux across space? Do you have a good feeling for that yet?
Yeah, so I've also realized that I should also look into how stability of the boundary layer also plays into this. So right now, from my review of the literature and what I've seen other field projects show me something, they point towards something very similar to what people observed for LitFuzz and other slightly more comprehensive field experiments, where you would assume that, I would think that there would be a more mesoscale transport when you have more variations.
I think we lost your audio, or at least I did.
Well, I think we just lost him.
Okay.
It not be correlated with the mesoscale transport in sensible heat fluxes because water vapor is not a passive scalar. So there could be some complexities there too, which have not been identified in these early field experiments. So the role of water vapor and the role of stability are two things which we need to study further. But essentially, I would assume that this would be how mesoscale structures change, and they would become more and more linked to the patchiness of the landscape as the domain shifts into a more fall or into a more patchy landscape. That is what I think right now.
Cool. Will be interesting to see. It also links to the earlier studies from Boreas and others suggesting that lakes are kind of these little convection hotspots, which you definitely see in that land surface temperature map where that lake to the northwest of the northeast of the domain is particularly hot.
Yeah. So even with studies that only looked at the turbulent transport, people have looked at, like you're probably aware of this. There were recent studies that are just based studies where they subsetted the data based on the stability and just looked at what happens to the scales of transport even for these turbulent ranges. And people have observed that the dominant length scales change with changes in stability and also changes in landscape. So yeah.
I give Brad has his hand raised. Go for it.
So you showed at the beginning with the distributed flux towers that there is this pretty significant residual that appeared to be in the daytime boundary layer. How
is it this one?
Yeah. How do you and now you're making measurements at 100 meters and 400 meters. Are you able to use those to
compare?
I don't understand how you use those to look for this this energy imbalance, because presumably at night you're all in a stable boundary layer and during the daytime you're not. How do you relate those? And that's the kind of the, I don't see how those two are connected, but and then otherwise you were looking at gridding on some kind of a grid. If you just look at your wavelet analysis along the flight track, so you still have all the full perpendicular information, do you see correlations between flight tracks that are mesoscale eddies?
Oh, I haven't looked at correlation between the flight tracks yet.
Okay.
And that's something that I haven't thought about, but yeah, thanks. I should probably look into that. And with regard to relating the mesoscale transport with tower measured residuals, what I'm thinking of doing is, so these towers are distributed across the domain, right? Let's say, so these towers are distributed across the domain, and then over the day they would measure. There would be a measured residual at this particular point in space, and then if I'm able to come up with gridded mesoscale flux maps corresponding to a particular time period where this particular residual was measured at this location in space, then I can compare the flight measured or the area measurement of the mesoscale contribution to this tower measured tower measurement at this point in space, right? So that is the approach that I was thinking of. When you have this location in space being measured by the tower and the same location in space being measured, the mesoscale contribution from this location in space being measured from by using wavelet analysis, and then compare how these residuals compare the residuals with the mesoscale transport across the domain, not just at one tower but all the 19 towers. But then yeah, this would only be over the day when you have flight measurements. Does that answer your question? Okay.
So you're assuming that the eddy covariance that you measure at that tower height is going to be similar to those two legs.
Yeah, that's one of the strong assumptions with this approach. And so when this method was developed, so the Mauder 2008 paper, let me just quickly go there. Yeah, we are assuming that there is no vertical flux divergence, which is, as you point out, a very strong assumption to make again. For the Mauder 2008 paper, they had flight measurements at, I think, 50 meters and 90 meters above the ground level. And when they compared, they didn't find much of vertical flux divergences. And we are measuring at 100 meters, which would, at this height, it would be fairly reasonable assumption to make. But when I compared the measurements between 100 and 400 meters, I could see that the fluxes were not, I mean, there is some divergence between the fluxes at 100 and 400 meters. And so when I'm reprojecting the fluxes measured at 100 to the ground level, that is something that I'll have to check at. There is no significant vertical divergence of the measured fluxes.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Yeah, I'll just add to that. It is certainly an assumption that we make. It is useful to recognize that, remember, the trees are about 25 to 30 meters tall, so we're technically only about 60 to 70 meters above the surface, which isn't that too far above the roughness sublayer that the flux towers themselves are at, which are, we tried to aim for getting at least 4 to 5 meters above the trees. So there may be some variance in that, but at least the theory is that, if we detect mesoscale eddies at the 100 meter level, that these are going to be consistent with what we would expect at the canopy level. To be determined, and it's something that also Brian is specifically working on at the tower level.
Yeah, you would have the tower to kind of link those, or to assess that assumption, right?
Yeah. So Sreenath, there's a question on the chat from Elizabeth Maroon. It says, I might have missed it, but I was wondering, with wavelet analysis, how is statistical significance assessed?
So, so right now, the uncertainties. So right now, the uncertainties for the fluxes are being calculated as median absolute deviations of the data, and not as spectral significances. So calculate the fluxes and the median absolute deviation from the median, and that is once again. So in the code right now, it is parameterized as a function of the integral length scale of the turbulence, and I'm still working on the code to understand how exactly that translates to a statistical uncertainty estimate. Like right now, I understand it as this. So because so this uncertainty estimate, this gray bar around the fluxes are the uncertainty estimates, and it includes both the random error and a sampling error, and both of them are being once again parameterized. So the statistical significance of a single wavelet spectra is not assessed, but we are looking at the measurement across scale is assessed as a as one standard deviation from of the total integrated scale. Does that clarify your question? I think you probably need to clarify on that further.
Yeah. And there is a follow-up there that says, cool, it would be fun to figure out how to apply an F-test with a spatial red noise as the reference data set to assess that.
Yeah. So I'm still working. So the code is being developed at Neon with Stefan Metzger and David Durden. So I need to work with them to understand how they actually quantify the uncertainties in the flux estimates. But yeah, the individual spectra have estimates of a red noise and the F test. But when you look at the issue with a spatial red noising and using an F test is also that for the flux co-spectra, we are actually calculating all of the data even within the wavelet cone of influence. So why we are doing it is because if you don't consider the data within the cone of influence, which is the area of the spectra where boundary effects could come into play, then you're essentially throwing out some information that is coming from land surface features at these particular points in space. Like say you say that the contributions at these points in space are not as significant as contributions from other points in space, but then you would not have a uniform you would not be able to look at contributions from all points in space uniformly, and that is the reason why uncertainty is currently being estimated as mean absolute deviations, and these median absolute deviations are being parameterized as functions of turbulence and not statistical and not being looked at in a statistical significance way. But that's a conversation that I am also trying to figure out.
Okay. Yeah, there's lots of fun things to go into it, and you're fortunate enough having the most intensive number of hours and kilometers of airborne eddy covariance ever collected in one experiment. So I think there's lots more fun to be coming. But since we're past time, I think let's go ahead and wrap this up. And thank you again for coming, and thank you, Sreenath, for a very clear presentation of a relatively complex topic. So thank you very much.
Thanks, everyone.
Yeah, thanks, Sreenath. Nice job.
Thanks.
Cool.